Hey everybody, it's Fancy. Welcome to my channel. Thanks for coming and hanging out with me for a little bit today. For today's video, I wanted to do kind of a little sewing project. So we are going to be making a cape. If you are a subscriber of mine or if you've watched my last few videos, you've probably seen this in one of my more recent videos from a few weeks ago. I'll link it up in the cards and I'll link it down below. I talked about wanting to do more like crafty things, and one of the things I wanted to do was do like a how to make this. This is a really simple, basic, unlined cloak. And so what I'm gonna do today is make a lined version. So if you're interested in that, then keep on watching. For this project, you'll need your pattern. We're using Simplicity number 1582, view C. You'll require 4 yards each of the main and the liner fabric. Those are 45 inches wide. You'll also need a needle, thread, scissors, and possibly a sewing machine, although you can do this by hand, along with some trim bits for finishing touches. We're going to be using view C, the short cloak, and for that we will need pieces 6, 7, 9, 10, and 11 to create this look. With our fabric folded in half, we're just going to iron all the wrinkles out. For tracing and cutting the pieces, you want to pin down the pattern to the fabric following the guidelines on the sheet. You'll notice that this one here had to be lined up along the fold at the top, so I made sure I did that. Also, I pin it down really tight just so that everything, it stays where you want it to be, and then you can just trace along the outside lines, and making sure you make note of any dots or notches. If it's a smaller piece, I cut through the top piece of tissue and it goes right through the fabric that way with my pen. Just that way all the marks get made and everything is where you want it to be in order for you to be able to have accurate pieces and put it back together. You can see here, this is the hood piece. It's a single fold, single cut on the fold. This is the neck facing. It's basically just a long rectangle with the 4 dots. You only need one of these. I cut out 2, but you really only needed 1. These are the shoulder, front, and back pieces. There are 2 of each because you need, 2 front pieces and 2 back pieces. And finally, we have the 4 pieces of the cloak. There are 2 for the front and 2 for the back. They are all identical. Okay, our first step is to do just a stay stitch, just a basic baste along each individual neck piece, and then connect the shoulders to the front and then the shoulders to the back pieces of the cloak. We're going to start by setting a baste stitch. It's just a really long straight stitch, and then again for each individual piece. So we're going to do 4 of these stay stitches along each individual neck piece. You just go straight down the line, and then this is what you get for each piece when you are finished with this part. Our next step is to attach the shoulder pieces to their corresponding cloak length. So we just pin along the straight edge, creating where we're going to make that seam, and then we just stitch along that seam. Now remember, we're going to do this 4 times for the main fabric and 4 times for the liner fabric. You should be making your liner cloak at the same time that you make your main piece. That way it just makes your life easier. Once we're done here, we remove the pins, and you can see we have a nice straight edge. We want to then press the seam upward so that it is laying flat. We pin it to the top, then we flip it over, and we're going to run a straight seam just along there to make the seams lay nice and flat. The next thing we want to do is connect our center back seam. So we line up the notch in the center of the back seam and put a pin in it. Put pins along all that whole long back stretch, matching up the seams anywhere where there are any, and then just run a straight stitch along that seam. Next, we remove the pins all along the entire seam, open it up, and you can see the back piece is complete. Our next step is to match up the front cloak pieces on their corresponding sides, match up all your little notches, and put pins there to hold it steady. And then we're just going to run a straight seam down that edge on each side. Do not forget, you need to add the other side on and repeat the process. So we're just going to stitch those on, and then we will have all the main pieces of our cloak. Be sure to trim off any long threads and of course remove all of your pins before you move on to the next step. Also be sure and press your seams open and flat. Next we're going to make the hood. We make a seam along the edge with the notch. I put in pins to hold it nice and steady, and then just run it through my machine. This is the edge that matches up with the corner of the fold, so this is what you'll get after you create that one seam. Next we want to be able to gather the edge of the hood because it's way longer than the neck that we need, so we want to scrunch it. And what we do is we just run 2 threads along the seam of the neckline. So I just draw myself 2 dotted lines, one that starts at the actual seam line and then one that goes inside that seam allowance just a little bit. It doesn't have to be perfect, it just needs to be pretty close. And you want to just run a nice straight stitch all the way through both of those, leaving lots of thread at the beginning and lots of thread at the end, so that you have something to hold on to actually do your gather. This is what it should look like along the neckline. And again, you want to have extra long strings on your bottom stitch. That's where you're going to be pulling. You're going to hold the you hold your bottom stitch, and you're just going to smush it along the threads to sort of create a gather. I start from one edge and work to the center, and then go to the other edge and work my way back to the center again from the opposite side. You don't want to over scrunch it because it does still need to go fairly wide, and you can see that you can always just make little adjustments until you're happy with where it is. Something that's really important is to find the center for the next step. We're going to mark the center really tight. We're also going to put an extra mark at our dots just to make it nice and obvious, because we want those to match up with our shoulder seams on our back piece, and we want the center seams to match up as well. So that's really important that you note those and put them where they belong. You just want to pin in those 3 places, and you can slide the fabric along the gather to make sure that it lines up where you want it. Also pin just all along the neck edge so that you can have an easy time stitching. And you just want to run this through your machine. Take your time, making sure you don't bunch up your bottom cloak fabric under the hood, or that the hood doesn't fold up amongst itself. This can be a little bit tricky at times, so you really want to make sure that it's nice and flat. For the neck facing piece, you just want to fold it in half long ways, and then go ahead and match up your dots, pin all along, and make yourself a guideline. Then just stitch along that guideline to give yourself a little flat rectangle. You're also going to want to press the seams out and press it nice and flat. Once you have that, then you can line that along the outside of your cloak just to cover that seam. We just put a pin at the center, pin along until all the edges match up, and then stitch right on across the back to create that facing cover over your stitch seam. And we just run it through the machine. Again, you want to be really careful here. Adjust, go slow, take your time. You can see the cloak will bunch up within the machine, and you don't want to catch it in your needle, so just really push everything flat. Trim off excess, take out your pins, and basically the cloak is done at this point. I also, as I said, already made the liner, so now we just want to attach those. And the way that we do that is we lay it out flat. We lay out our liner pretty side up. Then we want to take our cloak that we made, the outside piece, and lay it pretty side down so that they're sandwiched together and the ugly sides are facing out. And then it's just a matter of pinning it together front to back. We want to leave ourselves a nice space so that we can turn it right side out when we're done. So leave yourself a chunk that you're not going to sew, and then pin it together all the way around the edges. Here I'm starting by creating my opening. I found the center pinned on either side of the center to give myself an opening. And then what I did was used a crayon just to mark where I would not be sewing. That way I would make sure that I knew when it goes through the machine, if it hits that blue chunk, I don't want to sew there. And then it's just a matter of pinning all along the edges, matching up any seams. We don't want wonky seams. We want everything to match up. So if the shoulder seams, the neck seams, the corners, we just want to make sure everything matches up. And it's sort of a long, tedious process, but it's worth it to make it all look really nice. And then we just run it through the machine all along that entire outside edge, except for the little blue chunk that I created for myself where I said I'm not going to sew there. And then we go back and we remove all of the pins. Now the hard part is turning it right side out. You really got to kind of work your hand in there, find a corner, find a place where you can start flipping it, and then it's just a matter of working it through. It can take a little bit of time. I had to really wrestle with this a little bit because the main fabric is quite stiff, whereas the liner fabric is really slick. So having the two kind of did help because I could work one and then work the other. And it's just kind of a pain in the butt, but eventually it does come all the way out, right side out. And then you just want to give it a once over, make sure there's no loose threads, anything weird happening, make sure everything lines up nice and neat. And then we just have to close up the little holes. I just used a thin thread and just did a little round and round stitch to close that up. Now we just want to make the closure for this. I'm using some strips of bias tape and some beads that I had on hand. I just fold the bias tape down a couple of times to make it nice and strong. And then I just hand stitch it right to the inside of the closure. I ran some embroidery thread through the bead to sort of make a little bobble, tied it off, and then I just sew that loop right to the end of the bias tape. We of course have to repeat the same process on the other side. So here we have the finished product, guys. I really enjoyed making this video for you, and I hope that you enjoyed watching it. I hope you learned something, and I really hope you go out and you try and make your own cloak. The possibilities are truly endless. You could choose any number of fabric combinations, any style. You could do sequin, you could do tie-dye, you could do lace, you could do spiderweb. It could be super long, it could be super short, and I just am really hoping that you go ahead and try this. And then if you do decide to, please share with me. You can follow me on all of my socials. I'm on Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, all of those. I'm at Fancy Box. Actually, Twitter, I'm at Box Fancy. I'll link everything down below. But again, I just want to thank you so much for watching, and I appreciate you guys. And give this video a like and subscribe if you haven't already. I'll see you guys next time. Bye. Mwah.